Welcome to Taxpayer Empowerment. I'm Jose Melendez with the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Today we're discussing one of the most important issues facing American families, housing affordability. President Trump recently signed an executive order directing federal agencies to identify and remove regulatory barriers that increase housing costs and make it harder to build new homes. To help us understand what this means for taxpayers, homeowners, and future homebuyers, we're joined by Aaron Hedland, White House economist and one of the administration's leading voices on housing policy. Aaron, welcome to Taxpayer Empowerment.
Thanks for having me on.
So let's kickstart with the big picture. The administration put out this executive order which gets at, the regulations that are driving the cost of homes. So it gets at these regulatory barriers that we're seeing. How much of the affordability crisis today is based on a government policy, government created problem? And what are some of the biggest barriers you're seeing that are standing in the way?
Well, first of all, let's set the stage for the enormity of the problem, which is that house prices have gone up at essentially 6+ times the rate of incomes since the year 2000. And as a result, home ownership rates have fallen by close to 5 percentage points for people in their 30s, also quite substantially for people in their 20s. And the average age of a first-time buyer, some of the estimates have it at 40 years or higher when it used to be in the 20s. So it's a huge issue. People are delaying having families or delaying having kids. So the question is, what is driving this? And the Council of Economic Advisors, we put out a report in the economic report of the president that identified a $100,000 plus bureaucrat tax. Right? That's the label we put on it, because it's an assortment of different things that add to the cost of a home. And these things start at even before shovels go into the ground. The permitting process is very opaque, can take many months, many years, a lot of costs imposed by government during that process, fees that have nothing to do with actual costs that the community faces from construction. They're just kind of like, in some cases, almost extortionary funding that's required of developers and builders. And then you have the actual shovels in the ground costs that are added by government, such as green energy mandates. And this is something that the Biden administration did in spades. And they did it from the federal level, kind of coercing states and localities to adopt building codes that weren't about creating cost savings for buyers. They were about sort of shoving an environmental agenda onto people in a way that resulted in fewer homes being built and more expensive homes being built. I mean, we used to have in 2019 almost 1 in 2 new homes nationwide sold for under $300,000. Now, less than 1 in 6 new homes sell for under $300,000. And so that's that 6-figure bureaucrat tax that we can tackle.
So for someone who hasn't read the executive order, how would you explain what this executive order does, what it directs agencies to do, and maybe what are some of the regulations that are under review?
Yeah, so essentially what the executive order recognizes is that this is not just a federal problem, it is a state, local, and federal problem. Now, of course, the administration has zero desire to have the kind of philosophy that the Biden administration had, which is to meddle in local affairs. But what it does recognize is the importance of federal stewardship, right? There are already lots of federal dollars that are going to communities through programs that in many cases are supposed to help those communities grow and develop. And yet you have some communities that are accepting these dollars with one hand, while at the same time erecting barriers that drive up costs, which reduces the, how far those dollars go. So for example, somewhere like California, the average low-income housing tax credit housing unit costs $1 million, right? I'm not talking $1 million for a building. I'm talking $1 million for a unit. So if I'm a taxpayer in Texas, I'd be pretty upset if my money is going to DC, getting rerouted to California, and that's only producing 1/1,000,000th of a unit because it takes $1 million. So essentially what the executive order says is we want to prioritize federal stewardship and reward places who are putting in place conducive policies to building affordably rather than wasting federal taxpayer dollars. So what the section of the executive order does is it says, first of all, the federal government is going to issue guidelines and best practices that are sort of recommendations to states and localities as to what to do. And I'll address kind of the main categories in there. And then we're going to look at any grant programs to where there's legal authority to do this without legislation. And we're going to say, if you're a community that adopts these best practices, you're going to be first in line. You're going to get preferential treatment compared to places that are not doing that. So what are these best practices? There's many of them. HUD put out kind of a detailed document on it. But I would put it into 3 different buckets. The first bucket is promoting innovation, or put another way, removing barriers to innovation. And one of those barriers to innovation is the patchwork of fragmented rules when it comes to inspecting the building process. And so think about technology, right? There are many ways to build a home. Most homes are built with a bunch of guys on a site, hammer and nails, building the whole thing over the course of a 6-9 month period of time. But we also have people who are building factories that can construct homes in large segments, transport those to the site, and put them together over the course of a few week period of time. Just like you have the assembly line when it comes to vehicles. The problem, though, is that every locality has different rules for what that looks like in terms of what has to go into the building and the inspection process. That, in many cases, is unnecessary to have that level of fragmentation. Imagine if every single community regulated what a car is like and how it's built. You would never be able to have major car plants building Fords and GMs and other types of cars, because you'd have to have bespoke custom versions for every single locality. So this creates an incentive to have some streamlined rules, more uniformity when it comes to inspections and things that are unrelated to design standards, so we can have new construction technologies. And that's, by the way, very important, because we've gotten so much more productive in every sector of the economy except construction. Construction productivity growth has actually been negative over the course of decades, to the point where we are losing $1 trillion of GDP that we would create that we're not creating every 5 years because of that lost productivity. So that's that first bucket. The second bucket is really the kind of the approval process itself, streamlining that. Shot clocks. So for example, when builders are thinking about building a new subdivision, they know up front how long it's going to take for them to get the approvals, instead of having this long, drawn out, uncertain process, which is very complicated for raising funding. Similarly, fees. If a town or a locality is going to charge fees, those have to actually be justified based on the cost imposed on the community. If the community has to extend a sewer line to a new neighborhood, of course it makes sense that the builder help pay for those costs. But all too often you see places essentially do hidden taxes, which they call a fee. So there's actually an example in Northern Virginia where there was a builder who had been in negotiations with a county to do a kind of townhome development. Negotiations went on for 2 years, which is already crazy how long that took. They got to the finish line, and then the town said, well, we'll put our signature on the line if you agree to build an $18 million fire station on the other side of the county, which is literally 20 miles away. Right? There's no way that fire station was even going to service the townhome community that was being built. It was just a way to kind of extract money from the builder for things that had nothing to do with the cost imposed. So best practices would be to not do that. And then similarly, when it comes to the third category, is giving more consumer choice and removing mandates. If people want to install solar panels, great, go ahead and do it. But you shouldn't be forced to do that. And in many cases, not only, you may not even have a solar panel mandate in some communities, but they might mandate that the roofing structure be done in such a way that it could support solar panels. Well, that's a lot of additional lumber. That's a lot of additional framing that the homeowner may have zero desire to do, and yet they're having to spend thousands of dollars more to do it. So removing those sort of mandates, more consumer choice, and also when it comes to the rental sector, things like rent control and squatters' rights and things like that, those are things that don't actually help affordability at all. They just prevent construction from occurring.
Well said, Aaron. For decades, policymakers have focused on assistance and subsidies to fix the housing problem, but it's good to hear that the administration is focusing on those regulatory barriers, which we know drive up the costs. I think about Texas. You mentioned a couple of those buckets there that get at permitting, streamlining permitting, reducing impact fees. Those are charges that the Texas House here in Texas is taking up. Pretty soon we're addressing those problems. But in addition to that, we're looking at the success that we had last session here that get at a lot of those regulatory barriers that you mentioned, that allow us to build more. because in Texas, supply isn't quite nearly meeting the demand because people want to move to Texas and there's high demand for housing. And so in thinking about that, what are some of the lessons that Washington can learn from Texas, and how can other local and state governments around the country react to that and take it upon themselves to create more housing?
Well, as usual, other states in the country can learn a lot from Texas. Texas does things right. And actually, there's a section of the economic report of the president where we literally call it the 2000s Texas miracle. So, of course, in recent years, Texas has passed some major reforms. But if I rewind time a little bit, during the 2000s, that was a period of time when interest rates fell, right? And that's something that the federal government is doing a lot right now, is to try to increase supply in the economy so that interest rates can fall. And of course, the Federal Reserve will do what the Federal Reserve does. But in the 2000s, interest rates fell. But let's do a test case, though. Let's compare Dallas in the 2000s to Los Angeles in the 2000s. Los Angeles in the 2000s, they didn't really increase their permitting. They did not increase the amount that they built. So when interest rates fell from over 8 to about mid 5%, house prices skyrocketed in Los Angeles. And the net impact of the lower rates with the skyrocketing prices actually resulted in higher mortgage payments for new buyers. So affordability actually deteriorated in California in the 2000s despite interest rates falling. You look at Dallas in the 2000s, mortgage rates fell just like they fell nationwide, but there was a lot more construction. So all of that demand from lower rates went into more supply. House prices only went up 6%. So people's property values were protected. It's not like anyone lost value from prices plummeting, but people could still get in the market, and payments actually went down because the interest rate savings went to buyers instead of higher prices. And frankly, then later on, when you had the housing bust, which was because of bad federal policy, Texas was also pretty insulated from that as well. So supply has become more of an issue in Texas, in the 2010s and 2020s. But as you pointed out, the legislature and the governor's office have been very aggressive in making the necessary reforms to kind of enable that affordability to continue. And that's a point that I think is not discussed enough. I mean, for many years, Texas has rightfully kind of boasted about how its tax climate is so much better than places like California. But in many cases, the CEOs who relocate their companies, they're not just citing the taxes, they're actually citing the housing costs. And I actually remember, I believe it was a Toyota plant moved from Irvine to, I think, the Plano area. And one of the top reasons they cited was the fact that they couldn't pay the workers enough in Southern California to afford a house because the average cost was over $900,000. So again, as always, a lot of lessons to learn from Texas, which is that supply matters, removing regulatory barriers matters, and let builders go out there and just demand subsidies from the government are not going to be the solution.
Excellent. So just to wrap up the conversation, let's think about the executive order. Let's say that's successful. What does that look like, and what should Americans expect to see over the next couple of years? Or how do we know that these reforms are getting at more attainable home ownership for the average Texan and really the next generation?
Yeah, so I think a successful outcome is one in which house prices grow at a very slow rate. The goal is not to tank house prices or anything like that, but basically to stabilize house prices, kind of leave them where they are, let incomes catch up, right? Because if prices are stable but incomes are rising, then that gap shrinks. And then what you'd see is greater home ownership. There's absolutely no reason, because the population is aging, we should actually be seeing the home ownership rates go up over time, just because typically older people own more homes. So instead of being stuck at 65%, we should be seeing 66, 67, 68% home ownership rates, with people spending a lower share of their budget on housing. I think it's a very attainable outcome. And I also would expect to see some behavioral change, right? Once more communities recognize that they will be directly rewarded for having it be a more streamlined process, then that creates an incentive for them to do that. Whereas right now we have a situation where, unfortunately, there are some places that are very anti-building, and then they're still accepting federal dollars with their other hand. And this is a way to shift away from that.
Well, Aaron, it's exciting to see that the administration is in alignment with a lot of what we're trying to accomplish here in Texas. And as I always tell people, my favorite tagline when it comes to housing reforms and housing policy is build, baby, build, because the more we build, the more we're going to get closer to solving this crisis.
Absolutely.
Aaron, thank you so much for your leadership, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Until next time, I'm Jose Melendez reminding you it's your money, your government, and your voice.